No, thank you, Margot. Vabbè, I don't have much to say except to introduce Serena, that is our first speaker, Serena Merrino from the University of London, SOAS, on state independent fiscal multiplier. The rule of the game, if you go around 30, 35 minutes, and we have kept it quite open. Therefore, people will just interact. If you don't mind, they will interact with you, asking question, or I will read the question that comes in the Q&A or in the chat, and we keep it as much as possible interactive. Okay. Thank you, Serena.
Thank you.
The floor or the screen is yours.
Yes, thank you, Nicola. So let me share the screen. All right. The paper I'm presenting today, the key question of the paper is whether in South Africa the fiscal multiplier depends on the state of the economy, with a particular focus on private credit conditions. Then the paper also introduces a little but fundamental methodological innovation in the calculus of the fiscal multiplier. So let me start by giving a little bit of context on the lack of agreement on the use of fiscal policy in South Africa. As you know, since 2009-2010, growth in South Africa has been slowly deteriorating. And to mitigate the slowdown, fiscal expenditure has been systematically increased until reaching 30% of GDP in 2019. Budget deficits were mostly financed by foreign savings. And so the public debt has grown from 26% in 2008 to 63% of GDP in 2019. And actually it is forecasted to exceed the 100% of GDP by 2025. So as usual, there are two views on the effectiveness of further fiscal stimulus in the South African economy. On one side, there is the belief that growth is constrained by supply side factors, and so additional spending would actually crowd out private activity. And in this sense, debt consolidation could reverse these dynamics by lowering South Africa's risk premium. On the other side, the other alternative perspective criticized the idea of the belt tightening proposed in the 2020 budget and the fact that it can be expansionary. So according to this view, there are macroeconomic constraints, but the economy is also performing below potential because both domestic and foreign demand is low. And so according to this view, there is still considerable space for non-inflationary stimulus. So in this context, this paper tries to add another brick to the puzzle, I would say. In terms of academic discussion, unfortunately, views are once again mixed. So for now, since it's quite broad, I will cite just the landmarks. The first one is that when the central bank is bound by the zero lower nominal interest bound during recessions, then multipliers are larger than usual. And there is a vast literature that followed the global financial crisis on this. Another important argument is that the size of the multiplier depends on the state of public finances. Of course, this is quite intuitive. High sovereign debt levels are associated with small or even negative multipliers. Third argument is that the standard linear VAR methodology that is usually used to estimate fiscal multipliers is actually inappropriate because it can't capture the cyclical asymmetries of fiscal multipliers. And so the fact that the multiplier is usually higher in a regime of low economic activity than in a regime of high activity. Fourth, and also quite obviously, the instrument of fiscal policy matters for the size of the multiplier, depending on whether spending consists of consumption or investment, or whether it is deficit financed or tax financed, and so balanced budget. All these things, of course, have a role. And an important result in this sense was given by Ilsetsky in 2011, according to which tax cuts have a stimulative and persistent effect on growth in developing countries, but in high-income countries, spending is more effective. And this group of countries also includes South Africa. So in South Africa, spending is more effective than tax cuts in multiplying effect.
Hi, Serena. Can I ask a question?
Yes.
So in the case of South Africa, we are looking at consolidations. That would be either tax hikes or spending cuts. And international evidence has suggested spending cuts are less damaging to the economy than tax hikes. So are your results symmetric in the sense that I can simply reverse the number on the size of the impulse, and is everything the same, or does it matter whether I expand or contract expanding?
In my results, I haven't analyzed the symmetry of expansions or contraction, so I can't tell really.
Okay, thank you.
Not yet, but this is something that I can, of course, do in the future. Yeah. So yeah, I can tell whether they are symmetric or not. Thank you for the question. Fifth argument, which is important from a theoretical point of view, is a more recent argument, which is the fact that by addressing the issue of financial frictions during recessions, such, for example, asymmetric information and credit constraints in financial markets, the size of the multiplier is bigger than previously found. And in this respect, a paper by Konstantin Magrelov and others in 2019 has proposed a richer representation of financial dynamics in a stock and flow consistent model to estimate the fiscal multiplier, accounting for this sort of financial accelerator mechanism. The mechanism goes something like the following. So basically, the starting point is, of course, higher fiscal spending. This will reduce the perceived probability of default of private sector debtors in financial markets. And so fiscal spending will act as a strengthening of private sector balance sheets of households and firms. So on one side, a positive wealth effect will induce a kind of consumption growth. On the other side, stronger balance sheets will also improve the net worth of monetary institutions. And so these monetary institutions will be able to extend a bigger amount of loans and also reduce the lending deposit spread. So finally, the final result.
Hilton, go ahead if you want to ask.
Sorry, I can't see the comments. So, yeah.
Hi, Serena. This definition or description of the transmission mechanism with the financial dynamics, is this a common description throughout these papers you're citing, or did you pick one, or is this a generalization? Because it's very specific, the first statement. Yes. The rest I follow, right? That's standard. But this link between higher fiscal spending and the perceived probability of default, I mean, you could do this theoretically. Is there evidence from these papers specifically on this? Do they all prescribe to this first statement? That's what I'm really interested in.
Yeah, so yeah, if I may follow up on that, I think theoretically also you can think the reverse, right? So that if you spend more and people perceive that the government may go to default, this can also trigger something, no, on the government sector. It of course depends how the fiscal stimulus is financed, all these things, and we have been having the discussion the last 2 days. So I completely agree with Hilton that maybe you may want to refine that statement, under which condition this mechanism is going to hold.
Okay, yes. Thank you for both considerations. So answering Hilton, this description is referring particularly to the paper by Konstantin Magrelov, which tries to be more comprehensive than others because all financial agents are considered. So the model itself has been a stock flow consistent. There's more instruments, more agents, and so it tries to give a comprehensive picture. Other models, such as these ones that I cited, they are the first ones, especially Fernandez Villaverde is one of the first ones to consider the SGE models with financial frictions or heterogeneities in households' behavior, in households' characteristics, in firms' characteristics. So each of those provides a different kind of financial friction in the model. I try to be, of course, synthetic because of time constraints today. But this is basically the synthesis that Magrelov tries to put forward in their model.
Are there any theoretical models that you've come across that have described this relationship besides the sovereign banking nexus work that's come from Ricardo Rice and all the quotes?
These are all theoretical models because they are all DSGs. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. I'll look them up.
Yeah. And the second question was about, was about the government. Is it correct?
Jay, was about the
the fiscal stimulus. It depends all how this fiscal stimulus is financed, right?
Thank you.
So
Romain.
if you could really think that it increase the probability of default of the government, and this may trigger also perceived risk, right, in the private sector. So I'm not completely sure. There might be some conditions. So even these are derived from theoretical model, it may be helpful to really clarify under which condition this is holding.
Yes, thank you, Romain. Actually, this is something that I will cover in the next slide, but to advance this consideration. So the model, the estimation of the fiscal multiplier in the model by Konstantin Magrelov and others takes into account public finances. And so the estimate of the fiscal multiplier is conditional to certain things, such as the size of public debt, risk premium, and so on, amount of savings available, and so on. So let me switch to the next slide, and I will be a little bit more detailed on this. Of course, forgive me, but this presentation tried to be as synthetic as possible, but I'm very happy to expand all these arguments. Okay, so this is about existing estimates of fiscal multipliers in South Africa that basically reflect the broader literature in the sense that they really are sensitive to the modeling approach used, and particularly to the capacity of the model to capture both the structural and the conjunctural characteristics of South Africa. So I won't go in depth into each of these, but for you to note, we have exceptionally high estimates by closed input and output models, because these models capture the flow of money across industries in a closed environment with no supply side constraints. While Hilton and Kemp and Harry Kemp then demonstrated that spending multipliers are indeed smaller in open economy settings. Then, just to refer to the most extreme estimates, which are also the most recent ones, I will refer to Kemp and Magrelov. So Harry Kemp in 2020, he uses a variety of identification approaches in SBAR model and local projections. So basically he finds that spending multipliers are positive, but always smaller than 1. They are larger during recessions. Yeah, basically what we can say is that actually these estimates are consistent also with the broader literature on developing countries, because South African multipliers tend to be lower than OECD countries, for instance, probably due to inefficiency in resource management, in spending, in presence of supply constraints, and so on and so forth. And then I go back to Romain question, citing Makrelov once again. So according to this model that takes into account the financial accelerator mechanism, the financial market dynamics are able to amplify the multiplier during recessions, reaching an estimate of 2.5, under which conditions? First of all, the recessionary period. Second, debt must be sustainable and capital inflows are positive. And these are all conditions that were present in South Africa close to the 2008-2009 crisis. But then under different conditions, the multiplier by Makrelov can turn even negative. So the financial accelerator mechanism can amplify or destroy the crowding out private activity even further because of higher premium risk and so on. So basically what I try to do in this paper is to emphasizing the same link between spending, public spending shocks, private credit, and the state of the economy, so the business cycle. And I also add this very little methodological change that was adopted by Valerie Rami and Sarah Zubeiri in 2018, but it was never, as far as I know, applied to estimates of fiscal multipliers in South Africa. And so it could reduce the bias of the estimate. So let's go to the model. Please interrupt me if there are any questions. So I used local projections, which have been applied to estimate multipliers, especially state-dependent multipliers, quite a lot. So probably you know it, but I will go through it quickly. So the model requires OLS estimation of a series of equations for each horizon H and each variable Y. The linear version of the model is in equation 1, while equation 2 represents the nonlinear state-dependent version of the model. So in here, Y is of course the dependent variable, then alpha is the constant, X denotes the vector of lagged control variable that I will describe in a moment. And then shock is the exogenous shock that I will also describe in the next slide, which is used as an instrumental variable. Then the impulse response functions relative to Y are constructed from all the estimated beta. Sorry, there are 12 horizons, not 16. This is a typo. And I also included 4 lags. Then in the state-dependent nonlinear version of the model, I have 2 regimes for each state of the economy. So expansions are represented by A, and they happen with a probability F of zeta, of Z. And then recessions are represented by the state B, and they happen with probability 1 minus F. So Z here is the switching variable, and it determines the 2 regimes, in fact. So I picked the cyclical component of real GDP derived with the HP filter. So given the local projection method has got this very particular and important advantage, which is higher degrees of freedom, I could include 8 variables. So I have real GDP. So all variables are in real terms. So GDP, government spending, tax revenues, credit volume, which is extended to the private sector only, not the public. Private consumption and investment, the repo rate, and the debt to GDP ratio. I restricted the sample to the post-apartheid period because of structural differences, of course, and that's it. So here it comes the first methodological, let's say, innovation, which I took from Ramin Zubairi. So basically what happens when we have to estimate fiscal multipliers is that we usually use the natural logs of variables. And then to go from the elasticity of the log output to the currency units equivalent multiplier, the literature usually uses a kind of conversion factor called ex post conversion factor, which is equal to the sample mean of the impulse variable, so the sample mean of government spending divided by the sample mean of the response variable, which is output. So as you can imagine, this conversion factor is very sensitive to the sample used. And in my case, I found that the conversion factor that multiplies the elasticity, so the impulse response of log output, the conversion factor was as low as 1 in the period before 94 and as high as 4 in the period after 94 until today. So basically, just considering the period 94 2019, I had to multiply the output response, the log output response by 4. And then the conversion factor could have changed depending on the sample used. This is quite evident when calculating multipliers. So I decided to follow this methodology instead, which means to measure all variables or national accounts variables as a ratio over real potential GDP. So in this way, we are freed by the burden of multiplying the conversion factor. And then I was mentioning the shock. So the exogenous shock is identified as in Blanchard and Perotti 2002. So I basically imposed the Cholesky decomposition to a structural var with 4 lags with government spending, tax, and GDP. So with government spending ordered first, therefore assuming that government spending is unable to react to any other kind of information by the same quarter. And then from this system, I extract the reduced form innovation as exogenous spending shocks. And I include that in the local projections. Second kind of change in the methodology refers to the definition of the fiscal multiplier, because there are 2 in the literature. So usually we define the fiscal multiplier as to be the rand response of GDP to a 1 rand government spending shock. And the traditional way is to look at the impulse response functions, look at the output response at the peak. So whatever horizon, we take the peak response and we divide it by the government spending increase at horizon 0 at impact. This is the traditional way, which is the one I will show you in the impulse response functions in the graphs. And then I also calculated the cumulative multiplier, which is a better way to capture the persistency of the shock, of the spending shock, because it's calculated as to be the cumulative output response relative to the cumulative government spending up to the horizon that we are interested in. So up to that, to each horizon. And I will also show you the results for the cumulative multipliers. All right, so here we are with the first impulse responses. In this picture, each response indicates the rand response of GDP and credit to a 1 rand government spending increase. the first row is the linear case, then expansionary periods and recessionary periods. So what we can see quite evidently is that both output and credit responses are positive and persistent during recessionary periods. While during an expansion, the fiscal multiplier at impact is about 0.8. So it is positive, but lower than 1. And then it diminishes very quickly to a 1 grand increase in government spending. In terms of
sorry, Serena.
Yes.
How do you define here the expansion and recession? Above or below the natural rate?
So the regimes are calculated according to the logistic probability functions that I was showing here. So basically what I did is to check the SARB recessionary periods. Okay. Yeah, and so when there is a recession, F is quite high, very close to 1.
Okay. Okay.
Such as in the last 8 years.
Okay. Okay.
I actually forgot to include the picture for the regimes.
Yeah, because I was thinking about you can be an expansion but below potential, and therefore when you start to go up, that recession is finished. Mm-hmm. Expansion when is okay. Therefore, is the probability of being an expansion. Therefore, will be when he's in the upward.
But it's calculated with the output gap.
Or is in the upward element of the cycle, from the bottom of the recession to the top of the okay. Yes. Therefore, there is both a recovery part and an expansion above the potential.
Exactly. Okay? Exactly.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so
Andrea Masia, Andrea Romain, 2 questions. Andrea.
Yeah, thanks, Nicola. So I just wanted to just clarify, Dr. Merrino, you said something that just caught my attention there. You used the dating methodology or the dating structure of the SOB in defining the cycles. Are you sure you're not using upswing and downswing of the business cycles, rather than whether the economy is in recession or not? Because you said something about 8 years of a downswing. That sounds like a dating of a business cycle, not 8 years of successively negative GDP growth. So I just wanted to clarify, how exactly are you defining an upswing and a downswing? And then number 2, you also highlighted that your cyclical component of GDP is extracted out of a HP filter. Mm-hmm. So when you standardize by potential GDP, are you similarly extracting potential GDP out of your HP filter as well, rather than some sort of a structural model somewhere else? No complex Douglas functions or anything like that.
So the switching variable is simply the standardized cyclical component of GDP. So yeah, it's the HP cyclical component, and then it's standardized by R. Regarding, I mean, I think actually better defining, because I know that expansions and recessions, they can be defined differently. For instance, I tried adding as a switching variable using the moving average over 7 quarters of the GDP, but I had not good results. So, which is also a quite common feature in the literature. So probably I should refine the definition of these, but what I can say is that by plotting the logistic probability function over time, it resembles so it gets higher. There is a higher probability of recession when the SARB indicates, in a graph, in a usual graph with the shaded areas and so on and so forth, when the SARB indicates that the economy was under recession. So there is a clear common path between this logistic probability function and times of recession and expansion. So
this sounds like a business cycle to me. The SARB defining the phase of the business cycle that we're in, which has been in a downward phase for the past number of years. But I just wanted to understand, to appreciate what sample, when you're talking about downswing or recessions, exactly what sample is this applicable to? And it sounds like it's applicable to downswings of the business cycle to me.
Yeah, I should probably look better into this, I have to say. But yeah, thank you for pointing this out.
No, thank you. Thanks very much.
But yeah,
we
it's
have
actually
Romain Hilton as well.
Okay.
Yes, so thank you very much. No, this is very interesting. Can you show the picture of the IRF that you were sharing? Yeah, so I'm very surprised that while private credits continue to be permanently increasing, GDP then decline. So I think, yeah, it might be interesting to better understand what you are picking. Is it like the crisis period? So then showing the picture about the regime is very now important, you see? To which extent that period is just the correlation, you understand, during that period that is dominating the data. It might be very, very important to really understand. That's the first comment. And the second comment, it will be very helpful if you could dig further to try to help us to understand, and it can potentially help to understand your result, whether this credit increase is driven by credit demand or credit supply. So the credit supply will potentially be related to your story. Maybe the government, money of the government is going there. I don't know. You have to help us understand. Then the credit demand could be related to the health of the private sector, aiming to demand more credit. And yeah, this can help to understand what is really going on. Because I'm very puzzled about this correlation, and I cannot systematically relate this to this government spending. Unless maybe also you want to clarify on which item they were in fact spending when they increase their expenditure. Can you differentiate? Maybe that could also help. I don't know. This is just my first observation.
Thank you. Thank you, Romain. So yeah, this is the difference between these two is actually a very good question. Of course, I noticed that credit tends to explode in a sense. I think like in another representation with 16 horizons actually goes down at a point, but still it's much more persistent. Yeah. My explanation for GDP going down comes a little bit farther. So here, when I analyze the response of the repo and the debt, because monetary policy is not accommodative. So there is a contraction, this is the linear case, but analyzing the two states of the economy, of course, monetary policy is much more contractionary during expansions.
And why? Is it because it generates inflation? Do you have a response of inflation?
I didn't include inflation.
Because that you may want to understand, try to understand. Why is because GDP is declining. So the central bank should not increase. Maybe potentially inflation was increasing.
If I understand what you say is that the GDP is declining because monetary policy react.
Yeah, there is like a feedback effect from monetary policy and debt.
Potential
because debt is increasing.
Yeah.
And monetary policy reacts. So this was my explanation for this.
The decline of GDP.
Yes.
And potentially GDP decline, central bank increase because inflation has emerged, or?
Yeah, I should check inflation. I had problems with the time series, I have to say. Yeah.
Also, maybe the credit growth, I don't know. Maybe because of the credit growth, they're worried about.
Yeah, I think it's more interesting to find some reason for the persistence of credit growth, especially if you notice here, and I can. So the multiplier effect on credit is very, very high.
It's extremely high.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that the central bank increase interest rate, the credit continue to increase.
Maybe we can go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then we come back. Hilton, can you wait your question? We get there.
Yeah, I can wait.
Okay. Right, go ahead, Serena. Go ahead.
Okay, so here I have the responses of private consumption and private investment. So we can notice that the multiplier is of a Keynesian type overall in the linear case. And then the response of both consumption is here and investment is in the right. They are quite symmetric across business cycles. You can see consumption in expansions, it lowers while it grows quite a lot during recessions, and the same for investment. Also, the response is very significant. As usual, I computed the cumulative multipliers, and more or less, I mean, the peaks happens together with the output peak, so 6th to 9th quarter during recessions, of course. This is the response of the repo rate and up to GDP ratio that I already highlighted, so there's nothing else to say. Here I considered the Johannesburg Stock Exchange all-share index by the Financial Times. So once again, we can see that during recessionary states, the government spending shock has a positive effect, which is also persistent and peaks at about 0.3 after 2 years. While during expansions, it is less significant, but it is contractionary, basically. Let's imagine because of tax, because of the cost of capital. And then this is the response of output and credit according to fiscal instruments. So in the first row, there is only government consumption. In the second row, only government investment. So what we can see here is that the response of investment is much more persistent, and also credit, the credit response to a government investment shock is higher than in the case of government consumption. So basically what I want to say here is that both shocks have positive and multiplying effects, but a shock from investment spending exclusively will have a more persistent multiplier effect, both on GDP and credit. Also, I didn't include it in the slides, but government consumption only increases debt much more. And this is the last one. Yes. So basically, I had more questions about the role of public finances in determining the size of the fiscal multiplier. But maintaining this methodology, I had problems in the sense that I couldn't define the regimes of high and low debt, because basically unsustainable debt in South Africa was never an issue. And also I couldn't divide the time series with the dummy variable because there were not enough observations and so on. So the only thing that I invented is to get rid of the last 10 years. And so in a sense, ignore the last decade in which South Africa's public debt has been increasing. So by considering this reduced sample, I noticed that the output multiplier is higher. This is the linear case, all right? So with respect to the first figure that we saw, maybe I will show you in a moment, this fiscal multiplier, the linear, the average is much higher. Also, the response of credit is higher. It was almost 0. And the response of debt is lower. So by overlooking the last decade, it seems that the multiplier was stronger and the effect on debt was weaker. And basically, that's it. These are my conclusions. I will go very fast over them. Basically, the insight is that there is no single multiplier estimates, which is not something that I say, but all of us. In my case, the average multiplier is found to be below 0.5, but this is only the average. In fact, it peaks at 1.2 during recessions. And this is in spite of the fact that I did not use the conversion factor, which usually is inflationary. So considering the business cycle effect, considering the response of credit, considering that I don't use a conversion factor, it seems that these results suggest the presence of a financial accelerator during recessions. And then the other two nice findings are that, in fact, the multiplier has weakened in the last decade because of public finances, probably. And then the size of the multiplier depends on the instrument used. In my case, I just decompose the spending into investment and consumption, and investment is much more benefiting and persistent on output. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great. Hilton, then, your time.
Thanks, Nicola. I must just remember now. I was listening so intently at the end there. I can't remember. Luckily, I typed some stuff in the side here. Serena, thanks again. Yeah, nice and clear. I get the second time I get to see your presentation. I think that it just seems, just based on the questions that have come up in both times, and that you might serve you well to present results for both types of multipliers to try and actually kind of motivate this conversion bias that appears. Because I totally agree, that using the sample means, the relative sample means to, multiply that to get that 1 Rand elasticity or multiplier value. I mean, it's very sensitive to your sample selection, right? So I mean, it would be interesting to see that if you try to actually show that, and then actually, I think that would be a very nice contribution to highlight that bias. Obviously, how you use the potential GDP as the denominator also has its own issues. But I think if you could draw some of that out, you might really contribute nicely to the range of estimates. And I mentioned last time that we kind of focusing a lot on these point values, but they're so sensitive. You mentioned, depending on the sample, you might multiply your multiplier by 1 or 4. So you have a factor of 4, range. So that's just a comment. I just think it'll be useful because we seem to get stuck then on the multiplier measure and also the method. So that'll be the other suggestion. I mean, again, there are pros and cons to both approaches, and it would seem that the positioning of your paper is one that is kind of taking more of a general look of the literature. So it might also be worthwhile to look at the SFAR results as well, and to kind of track both of these. I obviously getting you to do, I sound like a bad referee. This is giving you more work. But just on the regime switching, I couldn't remember how you defined it, but yeah, just to point out, I mean, Harry did a very similar thing, you know this, and using the 7-quarter moving average of real GDP per capita growth, he shows the different degrees. I think he sets the gamma to 4, and then that tracks the business cycle phases really, really nicely. And that's, I don't know if you tried to use that in your SFAR. Did you use the same specification with potential GDP, or did you use logs of the variables to identify the shocks? I forgot exactly whether you did that for both the SFAR and the OLS regressions. Okay, did you use log?
Logs, yeah.
Okay, so you went the Harry route. Okay.
Yeah, to
so
define the shock, yeah, I did use only logs, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
I don't think it makes any big difference. So
yeah, so I just think, you know, stamping out these, there's more questions because of, it's difficult to squeeze in everything in a presentation, and then we kind of can get lost.
No, but actually, like regarding the bias, I was because this paper is under review as a SARB working paper, and reviewers of SARB told me to do the same, like to stress the bias between the alternative methodologies.
Probably the reviewer is Hilton.
Maybe, yes.
No, not this time. Well, it's good to know we're on the same thing. So, yeah.
Can I have another question? The model, DEP is constructed around a very specific mechanism, that there is a credit constraint during recession. Therefore, you increase, by fiscal policy, you increase the net worth of companies, the ability to therefore increase in demand of credit, and actually increase the supply of credit because the credit constraint is limited.
Mm-hmm.
Am I correct? Therefore, how do you then interpret those results as a validation of that? Of that mechanism? As a bit what Romain was saying, therefore, how do you identify a difference of just increasing demand for credit or an increasing supply because there is a reduction in credit constraint?
Yeah, no,
Okay, no, it's fine. No, it's fine. Yeah.
I don't know. Is it really relevant actually? Because how?
No, that's true. But that's that's why I ask, because therefore don't link it. In some sense, is if you link it that way, then you have to find a sort of variation in credit that are not. You have to separate the effect of credit variation. For example, you have. We did it with Caterina. We looking at bank and non-banks. Therefore, banks that have much bigger collateral constraint than non-banks mortgage provider. Therefore, the difference in behavior in two different credit market, the different rules or institutions, then will give a different effect. That could be a way, but obviously we have a problem as well because the credit market here is quite limited. Therefore, it's not that you have so many options. Otherwise, don't link it to that, specific interpretation. No, because at the end, it's about the fiscal multiplier along the cycle that can have a lot of different sources, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't. Definitely, one of the sources go through this big credit effect. That's great. Therefore, you have big credit effect that drives a lot of the multiplier. That is your observation. That after can be explained by this or by, but you are not worrying about identify what the source of the thing is. It's just that because this one is a country with a big financial market, probably this channel of credit is, because also you have this positive and negative. You have a positive effect or a negative effect that is also strange in some sense, because if you just fiscal policy reduce the credit constraint, you should do it anyway, independently of where you are in the cycle. Instead, you have an expansion of credit during recession, during expansion, and a contraction of credit during recession. Is
The
it
contrary. So credit expands if the fiscal shock happens during recessions.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
No, but if it was just a structural thing, it would be the same or similar in the two phases, because the fiscal policy reduces the credit constraint in any phase. Instead, you have this different that is quite, that is nice, is interesting in itself, no? Therefore, this big credit effect during recession, you can use as a multiplier. But it was just, was just to understand. It's fine, it's great.
Yeah, there's not, I mean, all your considerations, all your observations are, I mean, actually, I hadn't thought about demand and supply constraints on credit and how to capture these, but it's of course relevant, especially depending on the narrative that I use. If I want to use this narrative, it is relevant. All the rest, actually, it's, this is something like you have touched all the vulnerabilities of the paper. So thank you very much.
Yeah, there is also a remark in the chat. I think Hilton also mentioned the spread. Maybe that's also a good thing to capture.
Actually did. I actually
and what did you find on the spread?
Insignificant effects. Yeah. I used the bank lending deposit spread. I actually had several conversations with Constantine.
Yeah, so it means then it's then potentially demand, because the spread, I will have a spread that, so it's then giving you some information, I think.
I will think about all of this. Yeah.
Or maybe.
Thank you.
Which lending rate did you use exactly?
So, sorry, because there are so many rates. I use the prime lending rate on 3 months deposit. And then
okay.
Sorry.
Okay, I can follow up. I want to, because there is some.
But basically, what I don't know, I don't remember, because I was like, I mean, this paper is from a couple of months ago, and like, since this was not working, I was okay. There are so many rates, but what I found, and this was the point of the discussion with Constantine, there's not so much variability in the spread. So the problem was all the time to find two good measures for lending and for deposit that could actually provide some variability, because otherwise it was about the same.
Did Constantine not suggest the 3-month 10-year spread on the government rate?
Okay, 3 months and 10 years.
Thank you. Thank you very much, guys. Thank you, Serena. It was great.
Thank
Thank you very much.
Everyone.
Thank you.